Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange Program with the University of Florida. Thank you for joining us today. Today I'm excited about our presentation from Dr. Kevin Robertson, director of the Fire Ecology Program at Tall Timbers Research Station. Today Dr. Robertson will be talking about recent research that is helping to untangle our understanding of the relationships between fire and longleaf pine in mature forests. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Kevin Robertson received his BS in botany from Louisiana State University and PhD in plant biology at the University of Illinois. He is currently the Fire Ecology Program Director at Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy in Tallahassee, Florida. There he studies the plant community ecology of the southeastern U.S. pine ecosystems, the natural history of the Gulf coastal plain, remote sensing of fire, effects of fire regime on plant communities, soils, and fire behavior, and prescribed fire effects on air quality. He also provides extension and education regarding the use of prescribed burning and fire-dependent ecosystems of the Southeast. He's also a co-PI and a key member of our Southern Fire Exchange leadership team. So we're excited to have Dr. Robertson here today. Thanks for joining us, Kevin. And one moment as we stop sharing my screen and pull up your slides.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thanks everybody for showing up for this webinar. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how heterogeneity may be important in longleaf and other southern pine ecosystems, both in terms of pine regeneration and also recovery of the herbaceous or ground level vegetation. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. Many ecologists have talked for years about the so-called bottleneck to regeneration of the woody plant or tree component of savannas worldwide. So there's this kind of paradox where these grassy C4 dominated savanna lands in different continents throughout the world are maintained by frequent fire, which also tends to kill tree seedlings, and yet the trees must regenerate at some point or another through seed, and at the same time they don't seem to completely take over as long as the fires are burning. So this question was important in the southeastern United States too with regard to longleaf pine, and we're still kind of puzzling to some degree about what conditions longleaf regenerates and doesn't regenerate. And this was important early in the 20th century in the debate about fire as well, because some, especially from the Forest Service, who were all completely against fire at the time, thought that if you take fire out, that was necessary for longleaf to regenerate, and conversely, if you burned every year, you wouldn't have regeneration, just as an example, and we've been kind of talking about it since then. We've done some research on the Wade Tract, which is an old growth longleaf pine savanna, one of the very few that has been continuously burned all along. As far as we know, it's never really gone through a long period of fire exclusion, and so it's really quite a good example to look at natural longleaf pine dynamics. And here, as another mature longleaf pine stands, anyone who's spent a lot of time in these ecosystems notices that the regeneration tends to occur in these fairly dense clusters of young pines. And these clusters are often fairly distinct in their shape and their area, and they tend to occur in gaps far away from the trees. And so that kind of begs the question as to why, why do they regenerate where they do? Because they don't fill the gaps. There are lots of gaps like the one in the foreground of this picture where you don't have regeneration, and yet they tend not to become established underneath adult trees so much. One kind of knee-jerk reaction, I guess, of most people who have some familiarity with forestry would say that it's a light factor, but after measuring light levels, ecologists have decided that there's pretty much plenty of light everywhere in this type of an ecosystem, and doesn't seem to be that limiting. Dale Brockway and Ken Outcalt had a hypothesis that there was a root gap in the middle of these gaps, tree gaps, where you don't have a lot of regeneration in the gap close to the adult trees, but there's more towards the center outside of an area where the canopy trees are not competing for resources through their roots. However, upon kind of closer observation, oftentimes you would find longleaf regeneration that was in the area where you'd expect not to, maybe not underneath canopy trees, but close to them. And conversely, there are a lot of gaps out there that don't have any regeneration. And given longleaf pine as a masting species, so you can go up to 10 or 11 years even without having a significant seed crop, but still these gaps in a place like the Wade Tract have probably been there for decades, and so it's hard to understand why you might have regeneration in one but not have regeneration in another. So Bill Platt, who was a professor at Louisiana State University back in 1978, mapped a considerable area of the trees on the Wade Tract while he was working at Tall Timbers, about 50 hectares of it. And he and graduate students like Sue Grace started to ask questions about where you tend to get regeneration. And they came up with a hypothesis that maybe it wasn't just the influence of roots or light or other factors, but maybe it was fire. But first of all, they established that the longer distance away from the canopy trees, the lower the effect of those canopy trees on whether or not seedlings would survive or not. And this doesn't say what directionality the influence was, but it was negative. The closer the seedlings were to a canopy tree species, the less likely it was to survive. And I say survive rather than regenerate because in a mast year, they're basically seedlings that germinate everywhere. Almost every square meter of the place has seedlings. So it's really a matter of where they survive. And so the conceptual model they came up with was that longleaf pine seedlings survive in unburned patches, which occur preferentially in gaps because of low pine needle fuel load. And once established, these patches of longleaf pine regeneration suppress additional regeneration for centuries, even until the patch begins to dissipate, because once they become established, they start raining pine needles on the ground and influence the fire behavior such that it's hard for seedlings to become established underneath them. Longleaf pine, upon germination, does need a break from fire, up to about 2 years, 3 years, maybe even from observations we've made. Like the Longleaf Alliance say that if you plant a plug in the ground, you can burn it about a year afterwards, but that plug is already several months or a year old. So they do need a break from fire as much as they depend on fire to have this kind of exposure to the mineral soil, like this little seedling, to germinate and to become established. And so a lot of old pictures of longleaf pinelands in the southeast, you don't see a lot of regeneration necessarily because they burn annually in the winter, right around the time that the seedlings were germinating or the seeds were being dispersed. And so again, that kind of gave fuel for the anti-fire folks to say that fire was bad for longleaf regeneration. And in terms of annual winter burns, it may not have been all wrong. But if given a little bit of a break, they become established, like this part of an area of Pebble Hill Plantation about 2 years after fire, where one of these clusters is just getting going, very densely packed, of course, and will be slow growing. So to get a little bit better idea about whether or not this regeneration seemed to be associated with unburned patches, we used a couple of resources. One was the Platt census, this 50-hectare area where every tree taller than 1.5 meters was mapped. And Charlie Fairs is a friend and a colleague who at this time was a graduate student at Yale University, volunteered to map all of the juveniles, all the pre-Platt census individuals that weren't quite big enough to be mapped as part of that census, which happens every 2 or 3 years, and to see if they corresponded to unburned patches. This map that you see here shows in gray how many burns there have been since 2003. And so the black areas are 0 burns, or basically wetlands, and the white areas have been burned every single time since 2003. We've been mapping the burned areas and able to do this, make this kind of a map, which also helps us see where the unburned patches were, how many times they weren't burned, and whether they correspond to longleaf regeneration. So we created this kind of crazy looking map here, but basically we used the size of the canopy trees to buffer an approximate area that represents their canopy cover. So the dark green circles are the approximated area of canopy cover that's within areas that have burned every single time since 2003. The light green circles are areas under the canopy trees in a patch that went without burning, at least during one of those fires since 2003, which is represented by that kind of beige area if it's out in the open. And the blue circles are the are the longleaf juveniles that Charlie mapped. And you can kind of see just by glancing at it that they tend to be clustered in these beige areas where there is at least one fire that was skipped over that time, which is in support of our hypothesis that those are areas where these seedlings get a little bit of a break. Now you also notice that the seedlings don't fill up those areas, so there's still, you know, some question as to why longleaf seedlings don't survive everywhere where you have a skip. And there could be a lot of answers to that, including herbivory and survival of drought and others. A graduate student of Bill Platt's is currently looking into the herbivory idea, so there's more to learn here. The gray circles represent areas where there was a tree, but it's died in the last 15 years as recorded by the periodic census that Bill Platt's been running up. And we're interested in that because we just noticed anecdotally that where these big old trees die, you also tend to get a lot of longleaf regeneration. We're not exactly sure why, but I think that part of it is that the coarse woody debris serves as a fire break. You often see where a bowl has fallen on the ground, you get longleaf regeneration all along the edge of the bowl. Maybe there's 20 or 30 centimeters or a meter where the fire was blocked and allowing those seedlings to survive. Another thing could be that the coarse woody debris is burning for long periods of time and sterilizing patches of soil and killing the vegetation in those areas so that there's no competition from other herbaceous vegetation or woody vegetation, which might also give an opportunity for longleaf to get a foothold. So I'll kind of walk you through this table that summarizes the data. This 51.9 is the overall Wade Tract density of these juveniles, just as kind of a reference point. And then in each one of these cases where there's a greater than 1, that means that there was at least one time where the fire did not burn that area, and the 0 meant that there are 0 skips or patches in the burning. In other words, it burned every time since 2003. And you can see just as a grand summary, there's a higher density, this 161 versus 25, in the patches that went at least one time without burning. If you look under the canopy gap specifically, these numbers are smaller because we don't have as much regeneration under the canopy like we talked about before, but the areas that had a skip underneath the canopy had much higher density juveniles than the areas that are burned every single time, 62 versus 11. If we look in the gaps all taken together, the density goes up to 193 in the areas that had at least one skip and 36 that have been burned each time. If we look at an inner gap, which kind of corresponds to the Brockway and Outcalt root exclusion zone, buffered by about 8 meters from the edges of the canopy trees, then you get even higher number of 255 compared to 45 in the areas that had a skip versus no skips. And if we look in these, we call them reopened areas, or an area where you had a canopy tree that died, then the density is higher still, but it's also higher in the areas that burned each time. And in an inner gap that was also reopened, you have the highest density of all, 446. So you can kind of see the pattern here that in each case, there's a higher seedling density in the areas that had at least one fire skip, which supports our hypothesis. But there are also these other factors going on where overall, if it's in a gap, you have higher numbers, and in an inner gap, even higher. If it's in a reopened area where a tree died, it's higher still, and the combination is higher still. So that these different factors seem to be additive in influencing the density of longleaf regeneration. Just another point is that these unburned patches that occur, like in 2012, which was following a mast year, might allow a lot of regeneration in that year. But that regeneration, of course, being longleaf pine, survives. And so in a subsequent year, the unburned areas are gone and they burn again, but the pattern that came from that 1 year of a patchy burn is still persistent over time. So just the point is that this very ephemeral phenomenon of fire skips has very long-term consequences for the structure of the forest. So if we look at the series of photographs from the Pebble Hill fire plots that we've maintained since 2005, I just wanted to show how these unburned patches can kind of capture this regeneration, and also how the regeneration survives the unburned patches, because a lot of managers are scared to death of any patch that's not burned in a particular fire because they're afraid the woody vegetation is going to take over. So here we go, 1 year post-burn, the woody vegetation's getting a little bit bigger and bigger, 2 years, and 3 years getting thicker still. And what you can't see going on here is there's actually a longleaf pine mast year somewhere in here, and you've got seedlings under all this mess, and they're just kind of hanging out 4 years post-burn. It's about head high by the time you get to 5 years. This is our 5-year interval plots. And then we have a fire, and lo and behold, there's all these little longleaf juveniles with their tops burnt off. And a year after the burn, you can see that they're popping up over the herbaceous vegetation as the woody vegetation starts to resprout. And you can again see them here hanging in there as the woody plants get bigger. And 4 years post-burn, these longleaf juveniles are fairly well established. We'll burn this plot this year again at the 5-year interval and take down all that woody vegetation, top kill it again. And the longleaf will live for who knows how long. They could live hundreds of years, and of course start to shower down needles and help to suppress some of that woody vegetation. So, you know, we're not advocating a 5-year fire return interval for any area, but in these native sites, the point is that the longleaf regeneration, even though, well, the unburned patches, even though they look a little scary in terms of having some shrubby vegetation in there, they do seem to serve as kind of a nursery for these longleafs that'll win the day in the end. And, you know, the caveat here is that this is native ground cover vegetation where the woody vegetation is very flammable. We've got bluejack oak and turkey oak and other species that burn quite readily. So it might be a different story in old field vegetation where you've got mesophytic species that don't burn as well, where perhaps those gaps are to be feared a little bit more, but we haven't done that research yet. This leads into another study that I did with a graduate student, Maria Paula Magnani, through the University of Florida. It's advised by Debbie Miller and myself, where we took the plat map and using the sizes of the trees, identified these regeneration clusters, but also gave them ages based on the size of the trees, and also some pretty extensive coring that they did back in 1980s, I believe, or 1990s rather, Bill Platt and Rathbun. And so you can see that like I was saying, the consequences of these unburned patches that result in these regeneration clusters are very, very long-lived. And you can still identify these clusters pretty well after they've gotten to be over 200 years old. So we classify the regeneration clusters by age, and our main interest, or Maria Paula's interest, was seeing whether or not the herbaceous vegetation underneath these clusters changed over the course of the aging of these clusters, and compared them to these beige circles, which represented gaps that have been free from trees apparently for a very long time, for a few hundred years. But in the process of doing that, we also learn more about the cyclical nature of these regeneration clusters. So for example, total basal area, of course, you start off with 0 and a gap. In 10 to 50 years after regeneration, it starts to increase, and then it peaks around 90 to 130 years, and then starts to decrease again as the canopy trees die out, mostly by lightning strikes or maybe wind throw and other sources of mortality, and presumably will eventually become a gap again at some point in the future. And canopy openness has somewhat of an opposite, but not exactly opposite pattern, where canopy percent openness is highest in the gap and then decreases a great deal once those regeneration clusters become established. And then those begin to open up over time as, again, through just individual tree mortality and light penetration, back to something close to the original canopy gap situation. And then pine needle litter increases from your gap to the regeneration of longleaf and peaks at about 50 to 90 years and then starts to decrease again. The point here is just that these patterns are cyclical, and so they represent kind of a dynamic equilibrium in which the entire forest isn't shifting in one direction, but different patches within the forest are doing different things at different times and are kind of maintained in that state. Now, we did incidentally find that several species were associated with different stages of this cycle. There are a pretty long list of species in Asteraceae that were primarily associated with the gap statistically, and Dicantheliums as well, and some other species. And there are a lot of fabs or legumes that tended to prefer the regeneration clusters. Maybe because they're better at surviving a little bit higher severity environment, able to regenerate from seed and persistent seed in the soil and other. We don't know all the reasons, but there is some change going on there. The grasses, on the other hand, the perennial bunch grasses like wiregrass and sorghastrum didn't really change that much, either in the gaps or underneath the tree canopy clusters. They're pretty much a uniform thing throughout. And this relates at least somewhat to another project that we're doing, which is the Wade Tract Plant Species Project, where we've been listing all of the plant species we can find within the Wade Tract and also their locations. And I just mention this because, you know, as we're probably closer to 530 or 40 species, I keep finding more of them, that they don't just occur willy-nilly across the site, but they do seem to have very strong site affiliation. So little things like the age of the regeneration gaps, or just a little dip in the soil, or it might be a little moisture, or an area that's a little sandier, an area with a little more hardwoods. They seem to key into these different niches, which drives up the overall very high diversity in this site. Again, just kind of beating that drum of heterogeneity, and how it seems to be very important to not try to homogenize everything to maintain very high plant diversity. This is some results from the tall timbers post-burn evaluations that we do. Our land manager, Eric Staller primarily, and some others go out with a GPS unit and just at different places within the burn units take some measurements. So these points represent an accumulation of these points over about the last 10 years. The point here is just that the black solid dots are areas that were recorded as being more than 50% burned, and the white dots are ones that were less than 50% burned. And those white dots tend to be pretty strongly concentrated in the lighter green areas, which represent lower basal area. Again, just showing that basal area seems to be having a pretty strong influence on whether areas burn or not, and that could have an influence on regeneration. And even in these old fields, which are primarily loblolly pine and shortleaf pine, you do see this dense regeneration in these gaps, as well as some hardwoods that come up in there too. And this isn't necessarily what the managers want, because it's hard to shoot a quail through that and everything, but there's some evidence that these types of dynamics are going on in old fields, but we haven't really studied that a lot yet. Louise Loudermilk and Kevin Hires and Scott Paswinski, Joe O'Brien, and some others did some interesting research in sandhills. And I haven't mentioned this, I probably should have, that all the research that I've showed so far is in ultisol soils or clay hill soils that have a subhorizon that's somewhat clayey and retains some water. So they're more rich in their species, but also just the amount of vegetation productivity. Whereas in sandhills, there seems to be a different control on whether or not longleaf regenerates, and they found that they preferentially regenerate in association with the hardwoods that are there. So kind of a similar pattern in a way, but a different mechanism, in that they think that it's in those locations where the moisture stress is not as strong, and that allows longleaf to regenerate, as opposed to out in these sandy areas where maybe being killed by fire isn't the limiting factor as much as just drought stress. And this is actually more similar to mechanisms that have been presented for tropical savannas in a lot of places, in trying to understand that regeneration bottleneck and why trees become established where they do. So these kind of contribute to what Jelch et al. Called a buffering mechanism for explaining the existence of savannas, where in the case of the longleaf pine savannas that we were studying, the mechanism seems to be that the more trees you have, the more fuel you have on the ground, the more continuous the burn, and so there's a limitation on pine regeneration. And therefore, if you cut off the bottleneck of regeneration, eventually the adult pines will die from various sources of mortality, and it'll kind of go back to a savanna state. And on the other hand, if you have enough trees die that it's getting closer to a grassland, you don't have as much fuel in the ground, and that provides opportunities for more regeneration, which pushes it more back to that savanna state. So these might be processes that we want to kind of recreate through our management. Now, all of this is contingent on frequent fire. So obviously, if you take fire out of the system, then the whole thing's going to go to an alternative stable state, which would be a closed canopy hardwood forest. But these processes are able to function as long as fire is there. Now, this has led a lot of authors to think of these native longleaf pine savannas as being similar to other C4 grass dominated systems throughout the world, in thinking of them as very stable systems, not early successional systems that are dominated by perennial plants that resprout and resprout and resprout after fire. They're maintained by fire because the fire prevents them from becoming overgrown with woody vegetation, but they're also not very good necessarily at filling in places where the vegetation's been destroyed. So they tend to be kind of sensitive to soil disturbance. And Veltman et al. Wrote about this toward an old growth concept for grasslands, savannas, and woodlands, talking about the grasslands themselves being like old growth or late successional or climax even. And H. Chapman back in 1935 wrote a really compelling paper saying that was titled, "Is the Longleaf Forest a Climax Type?" Because he recognized that it wasn't early successional in the sense of fire denuding the vegetation and it coming back, starting with pioneer species, so on and so forth, as the succession models were saying at that time. And so here's kind of a schematic, that shows the typical traditional concept of succession, where there is a seer that starts with a blank state, and then you have pioneer species A, B, C come in at first, and then they're followed by D, E, and F, and then later on, you have this climax state, which is the dominant state that's very stable and is the most common state. And this is the kind of the state that Veltman and Chapman and others are saying really represents these native pine communities, in that low severity fire maintains this system rather than setting it back in succession. And all this seems pretty accurate. The reason I'm showing this slide and talking about this is that I think that there's also a situation within these ecosystems in which more localized small-scale disturbances really do create a blank state by destroying vegetation and creating a situation in which early successional species can come in, but it's not a big widespread disturbance like what was envisioned by people like Clements and early theoreticians about succession. But yet, there are disturbances in the longleaf pine community that causes vegetation to die, and therefore it needs to be replaced. And O'Brien and Joe O'Brien and Louise Loudermilk, Kevin Hires, and their group did some research on looking at even the influence of the large pine cones that longleaf pine drop and how they kill plants locally and they have to be replaced. Their conceptualization of it was that they're kind of randomly replaced by plants that are immediately around them. And I think we need to collect some more data on that. But there are also larger disturbances that can occur, like the mine spoils of gopher tortoises and tree tip-ups and areas with heavy coarse woody debris that burn out and sterilize the soil and actually destroy vegetation. And in these areas, it's at least possible that that you reset more of a traditional type of successional sear, in which you start out with these early successional pioneer plants, and then it takes a while for the later successional plants to come in there. These concepts are familiar to people in tallgrass prairie, where they talk about old late successional grasses, for example, like big blue stem that come in that take a long time to fill in old fields and such, even during a frequent fire regime. From a management perspective, we're interested in this because of this, disc lines through native ground cover. And we wonder, is this going to recover or not? I think it's very scale dependent, like the pine cones may not be a big hurdle to jump over. The gopher tortoise burrow, maybe not. This disc line, not really sure. As you go up from there, it might be a bigger challenge for the vegetation to take over. We did a little study at Pebble Hill where there is an abandoned fire break. This is a fire break that was disked over and over again, and then they stopped disking it so we could see what would happen there. And it was through native longleaf pine wiregrass dominated community. So we put plots there, and then we put plots in an undisturbed area, and then we put plots in an area that was disked one time as a fire break to stop a fire that had tried to come onto the property. And then we followed them over time. And just kind of long story short here, we were able to break all of the species that we found into these different categories. There's about 18% of them that responded in a negative way to the single disking. It greatly decreased them. Wiregrass was key among them. It was almost eliminated. And then over time, in the repeatedly disc line that was then abandoned, these were also poor colonizers. They didn't tend to come back into that disturbed area, even if they had the opportunity to. They're right next to it. And these disturbances were only about 2 meters wide.
Hey, Kevin, I think we lost your audio there for a second. Are you maybe muted?
Okay, you hear me now?
Yep, you're back. All right, good. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, sure what happened there. Um, okay, I was just saying that, let's see, let me go back here. There's a large number, about 50% of the species were kind of neutrally influenced by the single disking, and they're also pretty good at getting into that repeatedly disc line. So there are a lot of legumes in this group and some asters. Then there are some that were neutrally affected, and we don't know about their colonization, mostly because of a statistical limitation. And then some that were positively influenced by the disking, and they were good colonizers. These were your weeds. They either had good seed banks or they're wind dispersed and were able to get in there. So even within this native longleaf pine ecosystem, there are different species that have different life history characteristics that seem to have different roles in these small scale successional processes. This is a graph. It's an NMS, non-multi, uh, non-metric multi-dimensional scaling graph that basically the closer the dots are, the more similar they are in species composition. And in this case, each dot represents the community in the undisturbed community in white, and the once disturbed, once disc lines in gray, and the repeatedly disturbed area that was then not disturbed anymore in black. And so you can see that, there hasn't been a lot of change in the undisturbed community, although it is changing a little bit for unknown reasons. And then the once disturbed area was a little bit different and closer to the frequently disturbed area. But and it seems to be getting a little bit closer to the native conditions over time that we last censused in 2019. But this repeatedly disturbed area where almost all the vegetation was completely eliminated is way out here, a very different species composition, although it does seem to be starting to try to get back to native conditions, but it's got a long way to go. The point being that once you have a heavy disturbance, a lot of these plants just are very slow to come back, except for the early successional species. Another reason soil disturbance is important for management are exotic species, chief among them Bahia grass, which has been a problem in the Red Hills region. We've found that mostly it's not a very good competitor. It needs help from humans to disturb the soil for it to get established, but once it does get established, it's really good at keeping out native plants, unless you herbicide it and then immediately plant it with some kind of cover crop to replace it. But as long as the soil is not disturbed, the Bahia grass really can't invade or get a foothold. So this is another good reason to try to minimize soil disturbance and to keep that native kind of old growth type grassland in place if you have it to begin with. Of course, there are these species that tend not to come back into the disturbed area, even if they don't have very far to travel. So a lot of the vacciniums, the huckleberries and blueberries, some of the native oaks, very slow to come back, which those two have in common that they're animal dispersed. We don't really know the story there as to why they don't come back very quickly. Tephrosia virginiana is one of the few fabs that aren't very good at coming back. Angelica nodata, just some examples. And of course, wiregrass is sort of famous for not coming back into disturbed areas very rapidly. So that leads to another little study that we were involved in at Tall Timbers. A lot of you will recognize Bruce Means as the famous herpetologist. He's written many books and spends a lot of times up on top of tepuis reporting for National Geographic. He planted some longleaf plots back in 1981 in these plugs here, and then he had them remapped in 1999 and then again in 2018, which is work that TJ Losevicius, who is a student at Gallaudet University for the deaf and hard of hearing, he remapped the plots with me supervising them. And these black dots here on this grid, this 1 meter grid, show the originally planted wiregrass tussocks, which were full-grown tussocks, as you saw from the picture back in 1981. The blue dots are where they had spread to and also indicating their relative size in 1999. And then the red dots in 2018. The point being that they do spread out. They fill in the area, although rather slowly. You can see after almost 40 years, they've dispersed about 3 to 4 meters. So you have a dispersal rate of about a meter per decade. Now, these areas were burned about every 2 years or 1 to 3 years. And only about 5 of those burns, I think, were in the May to July period that you would expect to cause the wiregrass, in this case Aristida bayrichiana or Aristida variety bayrichiana, to flower. So you could probably up the regeneration a little bit if you burn more during that so-called lightning season fire time. But another interesting thing that we noticed, if we look on a meter squared by meter squared basis, the density of Tussocks in 1999, the higher that density was, like if you get up to 10, 12, 14 Tussocks per meter squared, in which case they're probably pretty small to fit in that area, they had a negative response over time in terms of density from 1999 to 2018. And conversely, if you had fewer tussocks in that area, then the density tended to increase over time. And so the sweet spot tends to be in this sort of 4 to 6 tussocks per meter squared area, which a lot of previous studies have identified as the most common natural density of wiregrass tussocks. And also, research by Jovanes and Kyle Harms and others at LSU showed that these tussocks tend to be uniformly spaced. And so it provides at least some circumstantial evidence that there are density dependent processes going on here and that their density is self-regulated. Again, the big picture story here is that wiregrass does fill in over time. It's just really slow as long as you don't disturb it again. However, one caveat there is some work that Kevin Hires and others have started doing on the Wade Tract, where they've mapped out these historic disturbances. Some of them were ring-arounds that they would disc to protect longleaf or to create unburned patches for quail management, old roads that cut across the Wade Tract. In some of these areas, we still don't have wiregrass after 40, 50, 60 years, and we don't really know why yet. It might be because of some kind of permanent change in the soil structure, or we don't really know. So some of these disturbances, especially those repeated disturbances like the one that are...
Kevin, I think we lost your mic again.
I keep sitting on it or something. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yep.
I don't know how much you lost there, but basically just the point is that these areas where vegetation is completely denuded can take a long time to recover, like some of these places even within the Wade Tract. So as you go up even another notch in scale, we can think about a lot of the old fields that we have throughout the Southeast, which were about 10% of the area as opposed to the annually burned range. And in this case, I'll go back to the same slide I showed earlier about succession and longleaf pine savannas, but instead of these disturbances being localized, they're widespread in the case of an old field. So you've got this big blank slate, and the low fire severity is more localized. So we did an experiment where we did a chronosequence where we found areas that had been abandoned following agriculture at different amounts of time ago, ranging from row crop agriculture today to 5 to 15 years, 15 to 30, 30 to 50, 50 to 75, 75 to 100 years ago, to kind of infer what happens over time when you stop disking and then start burning. And that's an important part of this experiment, that there was fire all along, and presumably there was, because most of these properties were there for quail management where fire was absolutely essential. And it's another one of those NMS graphs where each one of these symbols represents a plot, and their proximity represents how similar they are in species composition. So these blue ones over here on the left represent row crop agriculture, which is almost all weeds. And then going from pink to red to orange to yellow to light green is going from 5 years to 100 years post-agriculture. And the dark green here are native sites as a reference site. So you can see that succession is going in the right direction. So there is a good bit of recovery of a large number of species, but they can tend to kind of stall out between about 50 years and 100 years. And you get this, what seems to be a pretty permanent old field type of vegetation that never quite arrives at the native ground cover state, because of those plants like we listed that tend to be very sluggish and tardy to reinvade those areas. So, kind of the big picture here again is presumably small ephemeral disturbances like maybe a single disc area, a tree tip up, these kinds of things might be recoverable over time. But the wider spread the disturbance and the more persistent the disturbance, in other words, if you disc it several times instead of one time, it becomes harder and harder for this vegetation to return. So even though there are natural patch dynamics going on, from a manager's perspective, we would want to try to shoot, you know, if our goal is to maintain the native ecosystem, we'd want to try to keep disturbances within that range of more natural historic processes to maintain the whole ecosystem and not have it shift towards something more like this old field vegetation. Although, you know, the old field vegetation is really good news that we can get something that's this close to a native site by basically doing nothing but burning it. So not knocking old fields, because they're you know, wonderful restoration success if you start with a disc field. But on the other hand, if we have native ground cover, then that's probably something we want to keep because we probably can't get it back. So just some conclusions here. Native pine savannas are maintained by heterogeneity in fire effects through a feedback loop of pine stand structure, fuels, fire effects, vegetation, and pine regeneration. So, you know, those unburned patches may not be all bad. They might be part of Mother Nature knowing what she's doing, go figure. Frequent fire is the necessary context in which these processes are able to occur. And, you know, the work we did on the Wade Tract admittedly was under an almost annual fire regime. So take that for what it's worth. Even those unburned patches tended not to be unburned for very long, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. Although, like we've shown at the Pebble Hill fire plots, that 5-year fire return interval, there's still longleaf pine regenerating in and amongst those shrubs at a you know, somewhat longer fire return interval. Again, we wouldn't recommend that, but it just shows that these systems do seem to be pretty robust to some fluctuations in fire return intervals. With restoration of historic fire regimes in forest structure, the heterogeneity feedback loop should eventually become reestablished. In other words, even if we start with a forest that, let's look, maybe it's a pine plantation, you know, longleaf plantation, or something that doesn't have much longleaf in it to start with, we might expect these processes to kind of operate on their own as long as you have the native vegetation there to carry fires and the opportunity for longleaf to regenerate in them. You know, the point being that they don't necessarily have to be micromanaged over the long term. And we're really supporting initiatives for state lands and private lands to put aside certain areas to become future old growth sites. Just kind of let them do what they do and basically just give them their frequent fire regime that they need for those processes to operate, and not do much else, and see what happens. Another point, you know, is over management for conservation is possible and it's pretty common. So, you know, the goal of it's got to all be black may not necessarily be true depending on the system. Mowing and roller chopping of unburned patches, you know, again, the fear of those woody plants may not always be necessary. Disking to protect longleaf, create fire breaks, stimulate rootables, quail food patches, et cetera, should be minimized. Again, these systems can and have sustained a certain amount of disturbance because, you know, it's had natural disturbance in the past, but we don't want to tip that balance to some kind of a point where we can't get it back. Heavy herbicide for planting longleaf pine, that's always an irony to me. You know, they wipe out the native ground cover so they can plant longleaf. Happens a lot. And then micromanaging for pine regeneration. Like I said, these native structures can kind of sort themselves out, we think. You know, one case I know that happened on a military installation. They were just so concerned about there being too much longleaf regeneration, and so they went and mowed it all down instead of letting it just sort of compete and work itself out, which would have resulted in a much more natural structure. So native restorative processes are robust. They you know, again, Mother Nature seems to know what she's doing if you have the native components there in place. You know, we haven't figured out which aspects of these work in old fields and which don't, but they're slow and they require long-term vision for substantial restoration of pine savannas. So we need to have policies in place that keep up the fire regimes, that minimize the soil disturbance, that you know, cause us to take our time and see what the forest is going to do instead of trying to force it to do what we want to, if, you know, conservation is the key, trying to recreate natural structures and native systems. So I'll stop there, and thanks for paying attention. And if we have time, David, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks, Kevin. We do have time. So once again, if you joined us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin, and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. And that presentation that we just saw was from Dr. Kevin Robertson, the Fire Ecology Program Director at Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy. So at this point in our program, we do have time, and if you have the opportunity now to ask Kevin questions, due to the structure of how things work through the Zoom webinar, we ask that you please submit your questions through the Q&A feature in Zoom. You will see a little box that you can click Q&A and then type your question in. And we will get through those and try and see how many we can get through and let Kevin respond to them. So I'm going to open up. And we've already had a couple of questions come in during the talk, so please go ahead and keep them coming. While you were speaking earlier, Kevin, one of the questions that came in was asking about the Wade Tract in particular. And Brian was asking if you were seeing any, excuse me, any or many non-native invasive species coming into the Wade Tract through the frequent fire regime there.
There's been a little bit kind of around the edges. It hasn't been epidemic yet. Thankfully, we haven't seen Kogan grass yet. Probably the most disturbing invasive species has been pigs, because they're starting to root up the wet areas a little bit. There's some torpedo grass and some Japanese climbing fern in certain areas, mostly in those kind of woody areas that have had some disturbance in the past. But again, it hasn't been epidemic yet, thank God. But we're keeping an eye on it.
Another question that has come in, Brian also is asking for the old field succession study that you had the graphic from and you were talking about, do you have a citation to share for that project?
I said torpedo grass a minute. I meant tanglehead. So I'm sorry. A citation for which figure?
Yeah. Do you have a pub for the old field succession study?
No, we're working on that as we speak.
Okay.
That's new stuff coming up.
All right, that sounds good. Let's see.
We do have an older study that just compared native and old field vegetation, so just kind of a static look at mature old fields, and that's been published as Ostertag and Robertson 2007. I could get them that.
Here's a question that came in from Carlos. And Carlos says, "What about insect biodiversity?" It says, "My question is oriented to the predominance of some problematic species, such as bark beetles."
I'm not sure exactly what he's getting at in terms of the bark beetles. Obviously, wherever there's plant diversity, then there's going to be more insect diversity. And I do have a graduate student who's been looking at unburned patches and its influence on flowering phenology and also butterfly populations, and finding that the unburned patches stagger the phenology or the timing of the flowering and fruiting a little bit, which also seems to lengthen the time that the butterflies can use it, because you're effectively widening the time that certain flowers are available to a wider range of pollinators. There are pine beetles around. There was an outbreak actually just north of the Wade Tract easement area, and they had to cut a bunch of trees. But for the most part, they're spaced such that they don't, just spread across the landscape. So keeping pines spaced at something closer to a natural historic spacing seems to be the best thing to protect against them.
Glad to see more questions coming in. We'll keep rolling here. Tom asks, any research that suggests tools other than fire that can produce the community structure results comparable to frequent fires?
I'm not very intimately familiar with the literature on using mechanical effects to recreate those conditions. I mean, the problem with using mechanical and herbicide techniques, for example, as opposed to fire, is that you don't remove the biomass right away. And so, at least in the case of longleaf pine regeneration, they have to have that mineral soil exposed, and by having that material combusted and removed for it to become established. There are probably influences on the fungal communities as well. Bill Platt and Ben Sykes and others have been doing research on the Wade Tract to look at the fungal succession, which does occur even in the 1 or 2 years between fires. The fires have a strong influence on fungi, which is pretty interesting. We're just kind of wading into this too. We looked at that as part of this old field succession study too, where we found that the fungi parallel the plants in coming back under a frequent fire regime, but they change if you take fire out of it. So we don't know exactly what, what mechanically what the mechanism is for influencing the fungi, if it's exposure or temperature changes or moisture, or if it's the chemical input or changes in the plants, but it's important for that. And that's the foundation of the entire ecosystem. So, I hate to be completely negative about other methods, but there's just no replacement for fire, I think.
Here's a question that has come in from Seth, and Seth says, so many studies emphasize the random and neutral nature of longleaf ground cover colonization. But you seem to emphasize the role of niches. Is there too much emphasis on neutral processes in the academic literature? And are some niches destroyed by agriculture, suggesting microtopography, he says?
Yeah, I have to say, I'm kind of leaning in that niche camp just from what I've seen, especially with this plant list that we've been making with Bill Platt and Richard Carter and others. These plants tend to occur in particular types of environments. Now, I think it's very, I should back up and say, I think it's very scale dependent. So it's very possible that at the scale of a pine cone burning and killing a plant, that the one that's most likely to replace it is something that's right next to it that can easily disperse to that location, something that can clonally, run or spread into that little space. And then as it gets bigger and bigger, the disturbed area that denudes vegetation, then I think that the successional processes become more and more important. The ability of plants to disperse into those areas, or limitations on plant dispersals, with the extreme being like an old field, a big area that's been cleared out, and intermediate areas being more like a disc line or a loading ramp or something like that. So it is that question, I think, is complicated a lot by scale, and we have a lot to learn about it. But I think that there's a reason we have so many different plants, and it's because they're evolutionarily different evolutionary life history characteristics. They're filling different roles in this ecosystem that allow them all to function together. That's kind of what I believe more so than the neutral theory myself.
Here's a question that came in from Anne, and Anne says, when you were saying in the beginning of the presentation that certain units had skipped a burn and had more regeneration, is that saying that those units missed a burn every fire return interval, being 2 to 3 years or so? Or are those plots burned every single year and it missed a yearly burn?
In most cases, it was the latter. They were burned every year and they missed 1 year. And in most cases, they were burned again the next year. So it was just a 2-year interval without fire. Some of them were longer. I didn't show a graph that showed the distribution of how long or how much of the area had been skipped how many times. But most of them were only skipped once, and there's some skipped twice, some skipped 3 times.
Here's a question that has come in from James, and James says, has there been any research done on the localized temperature flares resulting from the burning of larger woody debris, the 100 to 1,000 hour fuels in the longleaf gaps?
Yeah, there's been some research on that. Morgan Varner's group is looking at duff in particular in reintroducing fire in areas that hadn't been burned in a long time, where you get that long duration burning of organic soil. There have been various studies to look at the influence of coarse woody debris. Certainly, the longer something burns, it's not just the intensity of the fire, but the duration of it causes the soil to heat up. It's more severe. It's more likely to kill roots and fungi, beneficial or otherwise. Of course, the concern in reintroducing fire in longleaf stands that hadn't been burned a long time is they have duff piled up around the base of the tree, and the tree grows fine roots into that duff. And so if that duff is consumed, then it can kill the fine roots and girdle the tree. But yeah, certainly there's enough coarse woody debris burning that at least locally it can completely sterilize the soil, and you're just sort of starting from nothing. Whereas the typical flaming residence time of one of these fires, like at the Wade Tract, is about 30 seconds to a minute, very, very short, which, if you put a temperature probe a centimeter beneath the soil, it won't even pick up on that temperature spike.
Here's a question from Matt. And Matt says, what kind of forest would result from regeneration density at the level found in the always burned plots? He says, that is, are the presumably small unburned patches actually important for long-term longleaf forest dynamics, or does it all kind of level off over time?
Okay, the first part of the question was the areas that are always burned.
Yep.
Can you read that part of the question again? I might have
Sure. He
misunderstood.
says, what kind of forest would result from the regeneration density at the level found in the always, I guess, the areas where they haven't had the gaps?
Yeah. Well, it'd be one without a lot of regeneration. You know, it'd probably be more similar to, of course, depends on the time that it was burned, but like those old pictures from the early 20th century, late 19th century, you have a lot of big trees without a lot of young trees, and that's what I would expect this forest to shift towards, instead of being quite as uneven in its structure. Of course, even with it, you know, in a way, there's no such thing as an annual burn regime because you're taking so much fuel out of it that there are always going to be areas that are patchy and don't burn, kind of like on the Wade Tract. So you'd have to be trying pretty hard to make it 100% black every time.
Here's a question from Carol. Carol asks if you'd be willing to share the full list of ground cover species that you observed in the firebreak study. I guess that's the Pebble Hill study. Is that available?
Yeah, sure. And I can give that to Carol. We're working on a couple of publications associated with that. One is actually a review of all the literature we could find on the effects of soil disturbance on species in the southeast. And so those studies are going to contribute to that. We hope to get that going pretty soon. Monica Rother's leading that up. She used to work for me, and she's at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. So hopefully that stuff will be up and coming in about a year or so. But I can give it ahead of time.
Here's a question that came in from Tess. Tess says, do you think your results about regeneration and heterogeneity apply to other managed pine systems that aren't longleaf, such as slash pine or loblolly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that slash pine systems probably should be pretty similar. I think they're probably similar dynamics. We don't have very many. I'm trying to think of any off the top of my head. Maybe at Eglin Air Force Base, like old growth slash pine systems where we could really look at how the natural fire dynamics are affecting the structure. And there just hasn't been a lot of research in flatwoods in general. So, but just given the similarity to longleaf and its effects on the fire patterns, and also its similar need for kind of a period without fire, but then it requires fire for regeneration. It has a lot of similarities to longleaf. Other systems like shortleaf, for example, it's a good question because shortleaf pine's different in that it resprouts. And so even if it's burned soon after it germinates, it can persist through resprouting and much more like a broadleaf woody plant does until it gets a break and can fill in the gaps. Native shortleaf sites like the ones on tall timbers that we have might have had a little bit higher canopy cover and functioned a little bit more like a hardwood forest in a sense of depending on light gaps and things than just depending on these unburned skips. Or we want to do some more research on that. At tall timbers, loblolly is probably kind of similar with a different time scale as longleaf and slash rather. I mean, slash needs a longer period than longleaf without fire to be able to subsequently withstand fire. Loblolly needs an even further amount of time, probably 8 years or so without fire before it can start to withstand fire. But similarly, it does seem to become established in areas with a lot of woody vegetation and unburned patches. It's able to persist there until you can get fire in there, which suppresses the woodies, and then it kind of takes over. So I think slash, loblolly, and longleaf function similarly, but again at different time scales in terms of how much of a break it needs from fire.
All right, we'll wrap up. I have one more question I want to get to, and then we'll wrap things up. And Todd asks, he says, you pointed out the various stages of old field recovery are moving towards the species composition of your reference sites, but yet they lacked certain key species such as wiregrass. So they were transitioning towards this desired state. But would you comment on the functional recovery of the system? So you suggest fuels and fire. Are you seeing that recovery?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point, and that's why I made the statement about, in a way, this is a great success story that you can start with an old field and end up something that structurally and functionally is actually very similar to a native longleaf pine community, even if it doesn't have wiregrass and some of those other species. And, tall timbers is a great example of that. It's mostly old field vegetation. It used to be cotton fields and other types of fields, and now we've got red cockaded woodpeckers and gopher tortoises and Bachman sparrows and Sherman's fox squirrels, etc. About the only thing that we don't have that you find in the native systems are the pocket gophers, because they seem to like those really sandy soils, which have mostly eroded during the agricultural period, such that we have these old field soils tend to be a little bit more clay. But yeah, functionally, for wildlife habitat, they're fantastic. And for quail, of course, I didn't mention king quail.
All right, let's pull this up here. Should be able to see the last slide there. It looks like we've run up to the end of our time allotment today. If you would like to follow up with Kevin, his email is on the screen. So Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. You brought together a really impressive amount of research into one publication, and I think folks were really glad to have taken the time to participate.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope that this webinar will be useful in your fire management programs, and have a good afternoon, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks.